The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a faint glow on the makeshift camp nestled deep in the Vietnamese jungle. The air was thick with humidity, heavy and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere conspired to make the day ahead more grueling. For the medic stationed there, dawn was not a time for quiet reflection or leisurely beginnings. It was a reminder that the next call could come at any moment, tearing them from their brief moments of stillness and plunging them into chaos. The camp was already alive with motion. Helicopters, their blades glinting in the pale light, lined the makeshift runway, their rotors waiting to roar to life. A medic, his boots crunching softly on the damp ground, moved with practiced efficiency toward his Huey. His kit, a carefully packed lifeline of gauze, syringes, morphine, and hope, hung heavily from his shoulder. He knew from experience that each item might mean the difference between life and death in the hours ahead. Today could be like any other, or it could be unlike any day he'd ever known. In Vietnam, predictability was a luxury. The medic had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to find a calm focus in the storm. He ran his fingers over the edges of the helicopter's interior, checking straps and supplies, ensuring that everything was in place. Each movement was part of a ritual that steadied his nerves. The Huey itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, its battered exterior bearing the scars of countless missions. The men around him moved with similar purpose. There was little chatter, just the occasional sharp order or murmured acknowledgement. It wasn't silence born of fear, but of concentration. The medic exchanged a brief glance with the pilot, a silent agreement passing between them. They didn't need words to convey what was unspoken. When the call came, they'd be ready. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as the sun climbed higher. A few men lingered near a coffee pot, steam curling upward in lazy tendrils, a fragile comfort against the tension that gripped the camp. The medic sipped from his own cup, the bitter taste grounding him in the moment. He scanned the horizon, his mind running through the countless scenarios that could unfold. An ambush. A firefight. A minefield. Each possibility carried its own horrors, and each demanded that he be at his best. The sudden crackle of the radio shattered the stillness, the voice on the other end urgent and clipped. Dust off needed. Coordinates coming through. Multiple casualties. Possible hostile fire in the area. The medic was already moving before the transmission ended. The Huey's engine roared to life, the sound cutting through the jungle like a blade. He climbed aboard, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. There was no room for hesitation. Lives depended on speed. As the helicopter lifted off, the jungle below blurred into a sea of green. The medic focused on his gear, double-checking every item. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He didn't think about what might await them at the landing zone. He thought about what he needed to do when they arrived. The Huey vibrated with the intensity of its flight, the noise almost deafening, but the medic had grown used to it. The chaos of the helicopter was a prelude to the chaos of the battlefield. When the landing zone came into view, it was worse than he'd imagined. Smoke billowed from the trees, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The ground was a mess of torn earth and bodies, some moving, some not. The medic tightened his grip on the handle of the chopper's side door as they descended. Bullets whizzed past, the sharp cracks of enemy fire cutting through the noise of the rotors. The Huey touched down in a cloud of dust, and the medic jumped out, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. The scene was chaos. Soldiers shouted over the din, some dragging their wounded comrades toward the helicopter, others firing desperately into the jungle. The medic's world narrowed to the injured before him. He moved quickly, assessing wounds, applying tourniquets, administering morphine. Blood stained his hands and uniform, but he didn't notice. His focus was absolute, his training guiding him through the storm. One soldier, barely conscious, gripped the medic's arm with surprising strength. "Am I gonna make it?" he rasped, his voice barely audible over the noise. The medic met his eyes and nodded firmly. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You're going home." It was a promise he intended to keep. As the last of the wounded were loaded onto the Huey, the medic climbed back aboard. The helicopter lifted off, the battlefield shrinking below them. He worked tirelessly during the flight, stabilizing his patients as best he could. The wounded soldier from before looked up at him, his expression a mix of pain and gratitude. The medic gave him a reassuring smile, though his own heart ached with the weight of what they'd all endured. When the Huey finally touched down at the field hospital, the medic helped transfer the wounded, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. Only then, as the last stretcher disappeared into the building, did he allow himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving him drained but resolute. He cleaned his gear, knowing that another call could come at any time. The day wasn't over, and neither was the war. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the jungle in shades of orange and red, the medic sat beside the Huey, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He thought of the lives he'd touched that day, the ones he'd saved, and the ones he hadn't. Tomorrow would bring more missions, more challenges. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet, the distant hum of the jungle a reminder that life, even in war, continued. The thumping roar of the Huey's rotors echoed through the humid air as the helicopter skimmed the treetops, its shadow darting over the dense, green canopy below. Inside, the medic sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by hastily arranged equipment. His focus was razor-sharp as he prepared for what was to come. The call had been clear, an extraction deep in hostile territory, with wounded soldiers trapped and under fire. This was no ordinary mission. It was the kind of situation that could turn into chaos in the blink of an eye. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset, calm but tinged with urgency. Approaching the hot zone. LZ's tight. Be ready for a quick in and out. The medic acknowledged with a simple nod, his grip tightening on the straps securing his supplies. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric, as the Huey tilted sharply to the left, dodging the uneven terrain and unpredictable winds. The view through the open side door was surreal, lush, vibrant jungle stretching endlessly, broken only by patches of cleared land and rising plumes of smoke. As the chopper descended, the scene below came into horrifying focus. The landing zone was a small clearing, barely large enough for the Huey to touch down. Around it, the jungle writhed with unseen dangers, the muzzle flashes of enemy rifles cutting through the foliage like fireflies in the dark. American soldiers were huddled in defensive positions, their bodies tense as they fought to keep the advancing enemy at bay. The medic's eyes swept over the scene, cataloging the positions of the wounded, the safest path to them, and the likely spots of enemy fire. The Huey jolted as it landed, the rotors kicking up a whirlwind of dirt and debris. Without hesitation, the medic leaped out, his boots sinking into the soft, uneven ground. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and gunpowder, and the cacophony of gunfire was deafening. A soldier waved him over, his face streaked with mud and sweat, yelling something that was lost in the chaos. The medic nodded, following the soldier to the first casualty. The wounded man lay on his back, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle and blood seeping through a makeshift bandage. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The medic dropped to his knees beside him, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he assessed the injury. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Stay with me." He worked quickly, applying a tourniquet and stabilizing the leg. Around him, the battle raged on, but he tuned it out, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Another soldier appeared, carrying a wounded comrade over his shoulder. The medic gestured toward the Huey. "Get him on board!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. He grabbed his kit and moved to the next casualty, a young man clutching his side, his uniform soaked with blood. The medic tore the fabric aside, revealing a shrapnel wound. He cleaned it as best he could, packed it with gauze, and secured it with a pressure bandage. The soldier's eyes met his, wide with fear. "Am I going to die?" he whispered. The medic shook his head. "Not today," he said, giving the soldier's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. The minutes stretched into an eternity as the medic worked, his movements a blur of precision and speed. He ignored the bullets zipping past, the explosions that shook the ground, the shouts and screams that filled the air. His world was reduced to the wounded before him, each one a life hanging in the balance. The weight of his responsibility was immense, but it was a burden he carried willingly. Finally, the call came from the pilot. "We've got to move! Enemy reinforcements inbound!" The medic didn't need to be told twice. He and the soldiers began loading the wounded onto the Huey, their movements hurried but careful. The medic climbed aboard last, his hands gripping the edge of the door as he scanned the clearing one last time. Satisfied that everyone was accounted for, he signaled to the pilot. The Huey lifted off, the ground falling away beneath them as the jungle rushed past in a blur. Inside the helicopter, the medic continued his work, stabilizing the wounded as best he could. His hands were steady despite the turbulence, his voice calm as he reassured the soldiers who looked to him for hope. The Huey was a cacophony of noise, the roar of the engine, the rush of the wind, the groans of the injured, but the medic heard only the steady rhythm of his own breathing, the anchor that kept him grounded. As they cleared the combat zone, the tension began to ease. The pilot glanced back, giving the medic a small nod. They had made it out. The medic allowed himself a brief moment of relief before turning back to his patients. The work wasn't done. Not yet. He checked each soldier, adjusting bandages, administering morphine, and offering words of encouragement. One young man, barely conscious, murmured something the medic couldn't quite catch. He leaned in closer, and the soldier repeated, "Thank you?" The medic smiled, though his heart ached. "You're welcome," he said, his voice soft. When the Huey finally touched down at the field hospital, a team of medical staff rushed to meet them. The medic helped unload the wounded, his movements careful but swift. He exchanged quick words with the doctors, providing details on each patient's condition before stepping back to let them take over. As the last stretcher disappeared through the hospital doors, the medic leaned against the side of the Huey, exhaustion washing over him. The jungle stretched out before him, deceptively peaceful in the fading light. The medic knew that this was only one mission of many, one small piece of a larger, brutal puzzle. But for those few soldiers, it had meant everything. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind already shifting to the next call, the next battle, the next life to save. As the adrenaline faded, the medic took a moment to process the events of the day. He glanced at the Huey, its sides scarred by shrapnel and streaked with grime, a silent testament to the chaos it had flown through. The war raged on, relentless and unforgiving, but in these moments of reprieve, the weight of what he had done, what he continued to do, felt heavier than ever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook, flipping to a page where he had scribbled names, dates, and notes about the soldiers he treated. It wasn't official protocol, but it was his way of holding on to the human element of his work. These were not just casualties. They were brothers, sons, friends, people who mattered. He wrote down the events of the mission in quick, precise strokes, making sure to document every detail while it was fresh in his mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of deep orange and purple, the medic climbed back into the Huey. The team was already preparing for the next mission, and he knew there would be no time to dwell on what had just happened. The rotors began to spin, kicking up a cloud of dust, and the familiar thrum of the engine filled the air. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself. The war would demand more of him tomorrow, just as it had today. But for now, he allowed himself a fleeting sense of accomplishment. In the face of chaos and destruction, he had brought a glimmer of hope, a lifeline for those caught in the crossfire. The Huey lifted off once more, disappearing into the darkening sky, its silhouette a reminder of the medics who carried out their mission with quiet heroism. Somewhere in the jungle, another call awaited, another life hung in the balance. And he would be there, ready to answer, because that was the duty he had chosen, the promise he had made, to fight not with weapons, but with unwavering compassion and unshakable resolve.